With the fires cooling from the most recent DLC launch from Total War Warhammer 2 in the Twisted and the Twilight, it's time to start this new year off by jumping onto the hype train and discussing some speculation for what the next possible DLC could be. There are a lot of options, but I think it's safe to say that we should be expecting the Beastmen as the biggest contenders, as they have yet to be touched, much like myself, since their DLC outside of the anniversary Regiments of Renown that they were given a few years back. Now, let's hit this up front. We still don't have Warriors of Chaos or Norsca done in an old world update style refresh. But to be perfectly honest, I feel like you really can't do a proper update to these factions without representation by the Chaos Gods. That's something that's got to be coming with Game 3, or at least I think, or better I hope. Let's take a look now at some candidates to go alongside the Beastmen. I'd love for it to be dwarfs, but I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think we have to look towards the Game 2 factions. I know I had been dead set on it being Warriors of Chaos and Beastmen, but I molded over a bit and I drilled down on the quote from Will during that live stream a couple months back of him saying that a Game 2 faction for a Game 2 DLC is something they really try to keep a focus on. So I think we can safely cross off High Elves and Skaven. The Skaven have been included in 3 DLCs, and the High Elves were in the DLC prior to the Twisted and the Twilight. This doesn't necessarily discredit them because the Skaven broke this quote-unquote rule already, but it's just the assumption I'm working under. That leaves us with Dark Elves and Lizardmen. Now, Dark Elves have pretty much their entire roster taken care of. Even the majority of their lords are crossed off the list, for the exception of one interesting option, which will be a subject in this video. In my opinion, Tlaxtlan and Khorne are just not interesting enough characters to have an entire campaign centered around them. I'd love to see a large legendary hero pack that includes maybe 10 legendary heroes from across the factions, these two included. But that's a subject for another video. And then we have the Lizardmen. So they also have not only their entire roster taken care of, they have homebrewed units added in the Sacred Kroxigors, and they have the Dread Saurian from the Monstrous Arcanum, but we're still missing the Troglodon and some other little hidden previous edition gems. So the Lizardmen are my frontrunner for the DLC pairing with the Beastmen. This leaves us with the Lords. For Beastmen, it has to be Taurox the Brass Bull, because he brings so much to the table. It can be a lot of other options here like Goros, but Taurox is the one that I want it to be. So that's the one I'm choosing. For the Lizardmen, I'm going to go with Tetto'eko, the Astromancer of Constellations, bringing skink high priests into the Lord section. And then finally, the FLC, Beastlord Rakarth, gives us a legendary Lord Beastmaster with some fun mechanics that I have in mind for the Dark Elves. The name I'm dubbing this is the Beholder and the Brass. I know you're thinking of the Beholders from D&D, but Tetto'eko's title is Astromancer of the Constellations, the Beholder. And nothing sounds better than a nice alliteration, right? So let's dive in on some of my unit speculations and campaign mechanics for the respective lords we've discussed so far. I'm linking my Beastmen Old World update video in the upper right here, so I'll be leaning on that as a reference point for some of the content in the Beastmen section, which we'll start with first. Also, you can find a plethora of supplemental videos to any content I've already covered on the lore of anything in this video in the pinned comment in the comment section. There's quite a bit, so feel free to dive through it if you feel like you want to really get around some of the other information of these characters. Let's get started on our speculation. Opening up with the big hooves, we have the Warherd of the Brazen One. I wanted to follow the naming convention of the previous Beastmen subfaction, so this seemed to make the most sense. Huge shout out once more to Weaponmaster 470 for this lovely faction symbol, as well as the one for Rakarth later in the film. He has been my friend through many dangers, and I appreciate his help greatly. Now, Taurox to me is just a natural fit for the legendary lord. He brings Doom Bulls to the table as a generic lord option for the Beastmen and gives them a true chance to focus on the Minotaurs through faction buffs, upkeep discounts, and additional goodies to the gnarled beasts. So in my previous videos, I've taken a look at 6 units per faction, and CA seems to have moved away from that number as the rosters have become more and more fleshed out. As a result, I'll be presenting you guys with 1 generic lord, 1 legendary hero, and 4 units. So a bit different, but it fits the overall scale we typically do in these videos. Starting with the heroes, Moonclaw as a legendary hero fits nicely into the setup, as Moonclaw has been speculated, not so much heavily, but speculated enough from some of the key art from Twisted and Twilight. This also gives an interesting hero option to stand alongside Taurox that makes for a caster character to be used alongside all the other Beastmen lords as perhaps a FLC portion of this DLC. Maybe as part of the rework is what I mean by that. Now let's go into the units. Again, we'll just be doing a quick overview and going more in depth in their respective sections. Also, as a quick reminder, this is not a lore video, so we'll just be talking game mechanics for each and every entry on this list. Each lord will have a link to their respective lore video, but the units we have are the Tuskgore Chariot, a nice, fast, ranged chariot choice. Tuskgore Herd, a bit of a cheaper Razorgore Herd with some other tweaks. Then for our big boys, we have to talk about the Gorgon. It's easily one of the most requested units in the Beastmen roster and brings a lot of really promising options to the table as far as gameplay goes. But another unit that is talked about just as much as the Gorgon is the Jabberslythe, the other disgusting monstrosity in the Beastmen's repertoire. With these two Goliaths in mind, I think it actually makes for a lot of really cool possibilities of massive beast battles, considering these new 2 entries and all the other stuff among the Lizardmen. When I had originally thought of these 2 factions matching up, it felt a little bland or boring, but the more and more I get into my headspace of Gorgons scything into a feral Dreadsaurian, or a bloated Jabberslythe swooping down on a Stegodon, slapping it over and attacking it with its wild horns, the hornier I get. But let's get into some details about the Warherd of the Brazen One. Starting with the leader himself, the Blood Beast, the Slaughterhorn, Taurox the Brass Bull. Taurox in tabletop is a super imposing model. Even the lore describes him as a grotesquely muscled doom bull, which makes for an abomination by even Minotaur standards. But I think he brings such a destructive presence to the table for the Beastmen. Khazrak is the only melee-centered legendary lord, with Morghur being more of a hybrid lord that relies on combat to use his chaos spawn abilities. But Taurox, being a monstrous legendary lord, cleaving through the battlefield is going to be awesome. Without any mount options, Taurox will have to have a ton of fun derived from special rules like Brass Body, granting him large amounts of armor, his rune-tortured axes, giving him a devastating anti-infantry, AP, magic, and flaming attacks weapon profile that will make him the bane of footlords, mortal or undead alike. This is a lord who doesn't need a ton of crazy items or mounts. I think that the model will speak for itself and how imposing he should be on the battlefield. I'd love to see him also have an anti-large, just be this absolute terror in the night, but that's just maybe a little too strong. It might be interesting to see Slaughterer's Call, the special rule affixed to Doom Bulls, just like Bloodgreed is to Minotaurs, represented as a 40-meter radius stun, root, or rampage breaking effect, rather than just simply granting Frenzy. Something that just kind of prevents him from getting netted and locked down easily, since he's going to be a large target anyway. He'll already be easy to shoot down because of that distinction alone. But across what I would assume would be a devastating high damage, high armor unit profile, and a ton of fun campaign buffs centered around Minotaurs, Taurox would be an amazing addition to the game. Moving into the Doom Bull, we have the generic version of Taurox, so I think it would be very similar. Grant him that high armor, that heavy AP and anti-infantry damage, but maybe with a variant that has a great weapon for anti-large damage instead. Or maybe the generic Doom Bull is anti-large, with Taurox himself being anti-infantry. I say this because you could kit them with either 2 giant cleavers or 1 massive great weapon instead in the tabletop. Then, again, grant that Slaughterer's Call ability with the capacity to grant a lockdown breaking effect and or frenzy. In tabletop, it granted frenzy, but I'd just like a bit more diversity added into here. I mean, I feel like we keep seeing Frenzy being added as some sort of buff from a lot of characters or a lot of abilities or items, so on and so forth. But I think this would be just kind of a cool way to differentiate things. What also would be nice would be an aura around the Doom Bull, much like, say, the Branch Wraith, that granted charge bonus and weapon damage, AP damage, or just melee attack bonuses to represent the Lord option that's chiefly focused on charging and aggression. Our first legendary hero we'll be talking about today, though, is Moonclaw. And we've already discussed this character in another video, but I think he has some interesting mechanics with Wave of Insanity and Unholy Zenith. Outside of that, his basics are just that he's a Bray Shaman with lore of either Wild or Shadow. And maybe there's a cool mechanic that ties in with the Dark Moon mechanic for Beastmen, which allows him to be either Wild or Shadow depending on the moon phase, which then gives him access to all that lore spells, but of course, like I said, you're relegated to those spells in a given phase or a given stage, whatever it is. Unholy Zenith could be a bound Searing Doom ability that would boost your winds of magic for every usage. The flavor text describes it as being a shower of warpstone, so I see it very similar to Searing Doom. But I guess you could, every time you use it, it's kind of like granting you also an arcane conduit at the same time, which would be a very interesting discrepancy from some of the usual abilities and items. Then Wave of Insanity I envision as a simple leadership debuff in a 40-meter radius around Moonclaw. So a very simple hero character, but a flavorful one that maybe ebbs and flows with other Beastmen mechanics to make him either stronger, weaker, or even just outright different. Pivoting into our unit section, we have the first one in the Tusk Gore Chariots. Now, the focus with this unit would be a cheaper alternative to the Razor Gore Chariot. Also, rather than being a melee-centered chariot unit, I'd envision a ranged chariot option, giving a bit more versatility to the Beastmen roster, especially with the additions such as the Scourge Runner Chariot being so devastating in the Dark Elves roster a few DLCs ago. The Tusk Gores are smaller than Razor Gores, so it fits the profile of being an overall smaller and cheaper unit manned by Ungors. Again, following in the same footprint as the Chariot, the Tusk Gore Herd would be an in-between unit between the Chaos Warhounds and the Razor Gore Herd. So maybe rather than having anti-infantry and armor piercing, they simply have the anti-infantry profile. And rather than being a smaller unit count like the Razor Gores, it has a larger unit count since they're a smaller model overall, but still threaten into a better range than, say, the Warhounds. One thing I worry about with a possible option like this is diminishing returns or roster bloat for the sake of filling a DLC slot. So if you have better options than the Tusk Gore Herd, I'm all for it. Go ahead and leave a comment below and we can discuss this a little bit more. But this was one that I think really fit in because the Tusk Gores have had very little representation in the Beastmen roster overall. All right, time to talk about the first of the two centerpiece units in the Gorgon. This Goliath of a monster had a dual kit with the Cygor back in the day. You either build one or the other when you purchase him, so expect something on a similar scale, but way more arms and way more blades. We're talking a behemoth with frenzy, immune to psychology, stubborn, that causes terror as well. I'd envision this creature as also having anti-large and armor piercing. My reasoning behind that is that I feel like anti-large plays really well into the Gorgon's lore and also the playstyle I have in mind for a possible Jabberslipe. Now they also get two interesting abilities, Swallow Whole and Strength from Flesh. Swallow Whole would allow you to swallow an enemy and kill it outright. But what if you could use this on another single entity below 10 or 15% health and kill it outright as the Gorgon tries to swallow or eat it? There needs to be some kind of tweak to this because it clearly can't eat a Hell Pit Abomination in one gulp, but it most certainly would be able to eat, say, an Empire Captain. Now, we've never seen an execute quote-unquote ability like this, save for the Chaos Spawn ability from Shadowgrave, so I think it'd play well with that existing mechanic. Strength from Flesh could act as a passive health regen, much like Hunger does for vampire units. In the tabletop, the two were linked. Anything you killed by swallowing, you'd regain health. So you could just put the two together, but I think the passive health regen plays well with a lot of the passive defense and health regens that other larger creatures get, such as Hydras, Phoenixes, and other big centerpiece models. Let's round out the Beastmen roster with the Jabberslife. Well, the Gorgon is kind of cool, right? A somewhat recognizable silhouette and one that is similar to a Cygor, but the Jabberslife is just a hodgepodge of chaos corruption, a chimera of all of the things in the forests of the Beastmen. And I have some cool ideas in mind pulled from the last edition of the Beastmen for the mechanics on this guy. First, I see the opposite of the Gorgon. So it can fly, has immune psychology, causes terror, has poison attacks, but does anti-infantry damage, which will play well with the other mechanics I'm thinking of. For one, Aura of Madness could cause a 30-meter or 40-meter area leadership debuff, and with its other ability, Spurting Bile Blood, acting as a Mortis engine effect of passive damage in a much tighter radius, say I don't know, 10 or 20 meters, representing the acidic blood spraying out from the Jabberslythe whenever it takes a hit or gets a wound cut open. Lastly, Slithery Tongue could be used as a quick AoE damage ability, whipping its tongue around wildly, hitting things in a cone in front or a 360-degree circle around the monster. In the tabletop, this is a ranged ability, but I think that making this flying, bloated, poisonous beast that just slams its way through infantry in a way that's completely alien to the giant in the Beastmen roster makes for a really awesome line-disrupting unit whose attack animations make it harder to pin down, kind of like what we get with the Tomb Scorpion from the Tomb Kings. But now that we have a lot of speculation down for the units, let's go into some of those Beastmen mechanics. We've covered a lot of this in the Beastmen Old World update video we did, touching on mainly what I have in mind for the FLC portion of this DLC. But what about some of the mechanics around Taurox, mainly his Warherd? Since we discussed Warherds sharing a similar mechanic to the Greenskins Wa, that would mean that each Warherd would be flavored as per the lord you're playing. So I think this would kind of goes without saying then that Taurox's Warherd would have a higher chance of including Minotaurs and, let's say, Gorgons. Gives a bit of spice to the brass bowl. Next, we have Slaughterbeast. Going more off of the Warherd notion, Taurox was renowned for destroying everything in his path. It's sort of what makes him this terrifying Minotaur of renown. But what if this played into his faction mechanics as well as his Warherd? So a normal Warherd, or Wa if you want to kind of look at it that way, you nominate a target, you go to sack it or hold it, whatever works. But for Taurox, it's a bit different. The mighty Slaughterbeast must clear everything before him, and that's your objective. This would make it so that your Warherd target then creates a path of destruction you have to create on your journey to that location, razing and killing everything en route. The game would show you a small map, then mark the path of each location you need to destroy on your way there. And maybe you kind of gain momentum as you're going through this path, increasing your campaign movement or maybe even battlefield movement because you're getting more and more fervor built up in your beast horde or your Warherd as you're just destroying your way through these objectives. This would all give you points, and any armies belonging to the Warherd target's faction that you destroy would also grant you points. There could be an info screen that shows you the point value for, say, defeating a legendary lord, destroying a minor faction, destroying a major faction, taking a strategic objective to that faction, so on and so forth. These points would then tally up with reward thresholds at 10, 25, 50, and 100, granting a buff that's flavored, no pun intended, with the faction you're racking up points with. For example, 40 points against dwarfs nets you 4 armor faction-wide, or even 25 with vamps gets you immune to psychology, 50 nets you fear, or maybe 100 nets you terror faction-wide. Things like that flavor your campaign according with kind of the rampage and destruction you're creating. But there's also, there has to be kind of some sort of adverse or negative. So for every point you gain, you also gain a point of diplomatic penalty with similar point thresholds. Now, it can't really just simply be, oh, they just don't like you on the diplomacy screen. There's got to be a little bit more than that. Something along the lines where 25 or negative 25 results in no more diplomacy with that faction, period. 50 results in an all-out war from all members of that race until it drops below 50 and what have you. So if you progress up to the 50-point threshold, sure, you might have gotten some pretty sweet bonuses, but now that race, that major faction and all of its minor factions are at war and will hunt you down. So you have to kind of balance this out. This can stack one layer further, where if you say attack the Dark Elves, you gain positive points with the High Elves and the Dwarfs. Something where you're always balancing this mechanic on a knife's edge. And it was something that we've seen a lot, right? In the most recent, like 3 or 4 DLCs, is that like all of them? Since the most recent DLCs, the mechanics they kind of present to us typically have you balancing something on a knife's edge, trying to decide, okay, if you go too much in one direction, it's going to create more penalties. So it kind of throttles you in its own way. It would be that maybe you're impressing that faction, so it's more of a forgiveness for past atrocities. So you'd be working on bringing your negative diplomatic penalty back to a baseline, rather than using this to superficially create an alliance with a faction that otherwise hates you. And maybe that there could be a kind of nod to the fight between Marcus Wolfheart and Taurox the Brass Bull in the form of a mechanic or an objective, but I think that this might be a stretch depending on how they want to implement their starting locations for Taurox, which is our next section. The starting locations for Taurox can be pretty diverse, but I'd say that the Aggle Wastelands in the northern portion of the map for the Vortex campaign makes a lot of sense. In the army book, we get a pretty clear-cut map of where the Beastmen are across the world. So their presence in Naggaroth is pretty prevalent, but with Throt and Iestra and Arahan taking up a lot of the more westerly and northern portions of that world, the Aggle Wastelands place them smack dab between the Dark Elves, Skaven, High Elves, and the AI-controlled Norska, presenting plenty of fun interactions and targets, and maybe even diplomatic allies in the Norskins. For Mortal Empires, I'd say you could just adapt his starting location to the same area on the map and call it a day. No reason to get fancy here with that map. This does put him very close to Hellebron on both instances, but I still think it's got a lot of good potential since there's so many Dark Elves to wade through to the west. Now, another alternative could be to slap this guy down near Marcus Wolfheart on the Mortal Empires campaign, but that area is so crowded as it is, and you could even put him somewhere in the old world to fight against the Empire. But now that area as well is getting pretty jumbled up. So now that we've gone into a great bit of detail about the Beastmen, let's crack a boy with the cold ones and go over to the Lizardmen. The Lizardmen have had a lot of additions to their roster since the launch of Game 2. So this was kind of tricky to squeeze together into a proposed list, but I think it actually makes some good sense. It does bring up a bit of an issue I'll talk about when we move into the unit section, but starting us off, we have our legendary lord in Tetto'eko. Now, I originally debated between this character or Oxyotl, but I figured that bringing a skink high priest into the table as a generic legendary lord would be a lot of fun. Also, the gameplay difference between a raging berserker minotaur and a meditative astromancer skink seemed like a fun contrast to each other. Also, I have some fun mechanics in mind for Tetto that I think could shape up the Lizardmen formula, I guess you could say. Again, with the generic lord option, we see the skink high priest here, giving us a different caster lord to choose from for those that want to stick with a skink build. Then for the hero, I want to continue this notion of more legendary heroes to choose from, and Oxyotl would be very interesting as far as a stealth range character goes. It's the same reason I thought he'd be a compelling legendary lord, but there's not enough going for him, in my opinion, to really give him that narrative oomph compared to Tetto'eko. Units-wise, we're really building up to the centerpiece units, just like for the Beastmen. Those are the real money makers here. Kulchin Riders bring a lighter, fast attack option to the table that is a step below the Cold One Riders. Feral Kulchins can fit alongside the Feral Cold Ones as a mobile, monstrous cab unit, but the Kodal is where things start to get really spicy. These things were actually a lord choice in tabletop, but I sort of envisioned these as something more akin to the Arcane Phoenix in that they're a very strong single entity. More on this later. Then lastly, the Troglodyte, the blind, poisonous monstrosity of the Lizardmen roster. So you can see we're following a similar build to that of the Beastmen. 2 smaller units with 2 larger, more centerpiece style units. You could argue for the presence of a Thunder Lizard in the roster, but those things were massive, and we already have the Dreadsaurian to fill that oversized monster slot. I think it'd be just a little overkill, but it's a good alternative to say the Kodal if they want to stick with just strictly units. But let's get into some more detail behind these entries to discuss some of the things I am thinking about. Tetto'eko is a really interesting character. He has so many abilities under the hood from 8th edition that could translate to a lot of fun campaign mechanics and the such, but I see him as a simple skink lord level caster, having access to perhaps a custom magic kit. His mount could be a Kulchin, Troglodon or Pterodon, and Palanquin of Constellations, his unique Palanquin. You could take this one step further and give him a Kodal mount to match Teclis's use of the Arcane Phoenix. It could be a very competitive way to give a caster a monstrous mount for the Lizardmen faction. But it might also just be a bit too much, so I'm on the fence on that one. Let me know in the comments what you think about this option. The Palanquin could grant Strider to Tetto and make it so that the skink units around it are granted a ward save or a physical resistance buff. I really want Tetto to feel like a force to be reckoned with for the skinks, much like 10-1, only a pure caster version. Tetto's other 2 items could grant some fun abilities as well. Eye of the Old Ones could give the army Vanguard. increase campaign line of sight, and grant ambush defense. I'd also love if it had a 2 or 3 charge activation on the combat map that allowed you to see any and all quote-unquote hidden units from forests or by stock mechanics. You click it, it reveals them for 15 seconds, then is on a 90-second recast. It wouldn't be a massive change in the game, but I think it'd be a unique mechanic that we really haven't seen before. Then the Stellar Staff could be sort of like the Staff of Volans, granting magic reserves, but then also reducing the cooldown and Winds of Magic cost of the Comet of Casadora, since that's the spell it focused on the tabletop. It could also just simply grant a bound Comet of Casadora if we want to take a more simple route. Ultimately, Tetto has a lot of really cool special rules in tabletop, and I'm going to be fleshing them out more in the campaign mechanics section, so we'll hold off there and move into the Skink High Priest. The generic Lord level caster doesn't need to be anything fancy, but it does need to differentiate itself from the Slann Mage Priest. It could have a faster recycle and arcane conduit, it could get a lesser shield of the old ones, but what I'd love to see is the use of Arcane Vassal. In tabletop, it allowed a Slann to cast spells through any skink with the Arcane Vassal special rule, which is neat, but it'd be interesting if Skink High Priests and Skink Priests could sort of, commune, adding to their Winds of Magic regeneration and reserves at a passive rate. So having certain units on the battlefield with the Arcane Vassal ability would grant an additive passive bonus. You might not have the powerhouse of a Slann, but you'd have a much higher rate of casting spells, which I feel is a really cool trade-off. Skink Priests have access to Heavens and Beasts, but we could give the High Priests access to the previous 2, plus maybe Light and High Magic, just to add some spice in there. I thought about it'd be cool giving them Dark Magic, but that's just a little too much here. For our legendary hero, Oxyotl is a chameleon skink special character that could be a lot of fun on the battlefield. From a campaign perspective, grant him, increased ambush success chance, ambush defense, and maybe he has a level 12 hero ability to grant the army he's attached to Lightning Strike. This would be a really unique way to leverage Oxyotl's ambushing hunting lore that the 8th edition lays out before us. It'd also be a really great way to kind of break the cookie cutter mold that a lot of us approach our legendary lords, and always going down the blue line and getting Lightning Strike and making it so that our character, our main focus, legendary lord, can actually be competitive in the higher difficulties of the campaign where you have multiple stacks to deal with against the AI. But he still has to be viable on the campaign and the battle map though, and that can be done by utilizing his innate profile. Snipe, stalk, poison range attacks, and then maybe grant him AP for a little added value in there. He has the golden blowpipe of Patui, which gives the multiple shot special rule, so he could shoot 2 or 3 shots per volley maybe, or he simply has anti-infantry, allowing him to really shoot things down at range. Just something to kind of give a nod to that. Now, in addition, Master Predator, a rule that he had in tabletop, effectively increases the damage the chameleon can do when stationary. And I think that would be a pretty cool trade-off here. Sure, he can move and shoot, but you can stay still and do increasing damage for as long as Oxyotl acts as effectively a stealth turret. Think of something like the Berserk ability, only granting increased missile damage and increased missile accuracy in 3 stages instead. So you, as the player, have to decide if keeping him in place is worth the risk of the increased damage and accuracy. It could be a really fun way to balance out just having this Waystalker-esque Lizardman character. But now that we've gone into a lot of the fun Lord and Hero units, let's talk about some of the normal units. The Colchian Riders are unique in that they're effectively these pissed off dodo birds with skinks on them, looking to karate chop everything with their beaks, squawking the entire time. Have I ever mentioned how much I hate birds? They're loud, they carry plagues, and then they're loud. The Colchians, though, could be a fast attack style unit, with maybe a melee or skink blow dart variation, with Strider since they have barely working wings. Now, we'll go more into the Colchians and their larger overarching presence in the next entry, but I was discussing earlier at the start of the Lizardmen section how a unit like this could present some possible issues. I think the Colchian Riders are really cool and flavorful, but what I worry about with these DLCs and unit additions is that we're getting rather homogenous armies. What I mean by that is that we're getting answers for everything. What made the armies unique was that they didn't have, say, a fast cab option, but instead they had an overwhelmingly large monstrous beast presence, or maybe they didn't have mounted archers, but instead have artillery pieces. Now, I think the battlefield of a Total War game forces you to play Warhammer in a way that will not match up one-to-one with the tabletop because of the sheer scope of the battlefield. I mean, you could place an army across the length of a game board and they'd be nigh unflankable. But in Total War Warhammer, no army has that ability unless really spread out or you go very wide. So it's just something I want to bring up because I know a lot of you are thinking this, and so am I, but I think that it's appropriate considering how vast of a field we're dealing with. I'll step off my soapbox, but let me know what you guys think about this. We've gotten a lot of lower cost, quote unquote, in-between units in the last 2 DLCs that slot right betwixt a cheaper and more expensive unit, fitting a similar role, or we've gotten some sort of hole in an army roster fixed. Glade Riders with spears being a chief example. The Colchian Riders being another, fitting the hole of zero means to chase down fast-moving cavalry, something the Beastmen have in spades, for the Lizardmen. Now, the Feral Colchians would be much as the same as before. Cheaper, prone to rampage, but maybe with the added benefit of frenzy and retaining their Strider mechanic. In addition to their presence as a unit, I'd love to see Colchians added as a mount to the Skink heroes. Give priests and chiefs the ability to mount these guys, adding some fast-moving ground ability. You could argue that if you want to have them move fast, just keep them on a pterodon. But if they're the only thing that's flying, or the enemy has tons of archers, they'll just get peppered out of the fight immediately. This gives them a chance to move around the battlefield quickly. They can move in tow with maybe a Scar veteran that is on a Carnosaur, or maybe one that is on a Cold One. Whatever the option is, the Colchian will allow it to get pretty mobile in its battlefield applications. The first centerpiece unit for the Lizardmen is the Codal, and it's a wild one. This bad boy had its last appearance in a Warhammer Chronicles entry back in 2004, but it's a really fun unit. The Codal has a lot going for it. It's a caster with light, life, or heavens at its disposal, some really cool passive effects such as Magical Storm, which would give a natural missile resistance, or Master of the Sacred Places, allowing you to move jungle set pieces on the tabletop. If we're looking at this as a standalone unit though, I'd envision this with 2 or 3 bound spells from Life, Light, or Heavens, AP, Anti-Large, Flying Beast that'd swat things with its massive tail. Now, I'd love if it also had a stun breaking effect, sort of like what we talked about in the Beastmen section, but instead, breaking flying snares. This could be a little broken as anything that cancels out rules typically can be, but I think it'd be at least a fun way to counter single entity unit snare and burst downs. It could have a bound single-use Shield of the Old Ones like the Slan do, giving Shield of the Old Ones to a Tetto'eko playthrough or a Skink build. Now, the Codal could be an interesting mount as well for Tetto'eko in the same vein as Teclis as mentioned earlier, giving this thing a larger presence in the competitive scene by making a Caster Lord more durable by virtue of a terrifying mount. Speaking of terrifying mounts though, let's jump into our last unit in the Troglodyte. I think of all the units for the Lizardmen, Troglodyte is the one that's been most requested, next to maybe the Dreadsaurian. It's the last unit in the 8th edition army book that's missing outside of, say, Jungle Swarms, and to be honest, it's a badass one. It used a lot of the same parts as the Carnosaur and was a dual kit, so they share roughly the same model, making it easy for CA to pop into the game. But the Troglodyte's profile would sort of be the opposite of the Carnosaur, I'd imagine. Anti-infantry rather than anti-large, AP, poison attacks with the Skink Oracle on top, since the thing is blind and hard to control. The Skink Oracle would then grant us that arcane vassal ability that we talked about earlier, aiding in the passive buff granted by it. Maybe the Codal also has the arcane vassal ability, making it worthwhile to bring on its own as an army buff. The Troglodyte also had Primeval Roar, an ability which buffed the attack of certain units, so this could be one of 2 implementations. We see it as an activatable, larger melee attack bonus, or it's a passive smaller melee attack bonus, much like Call of the Woods that we've mentioned before. Also, Spit Venom could act just like Throg's Spit ability in my mind, just a ranged poison attack ability that does good damage to infantry units. Again, focusing heavily on the anti-infantry role for this bad boy. Now that we've talked about units and lords, let's get into some new fun Lizardmen mechanics, as I have plenty to discuss. For these mechanics, we can lean heavily on the notion of prophecies built into the lore for Tetto'eko, and I think it'd be a really fun driving force for the narrative of his campaign. Perhaps to tie the two together, there's a prophecy of the Old Ones that says a Warherd will destroy a holy site of the Old Ones, and Tetto has to discover who it is. Spoiler alert, it's Taurox. So for prophecies, these prophecies can be divided into major and minor prophecies. The major ones are linked to unique items for Tetto'eko and campaign objectives, and the minor ones will occasionally appear from time to time for certain buffs like research rate, upkeep, large sums of money, blessed spawnings, items, what have you. The major prophecies will be given through a series of hints and multi-stage stuff, much like the sea shanties, guiding the player through the narrative of Tetto. The minor prophecies can be like a cross between the treasure hunts of the Vampire Coast and the Zarkan side quests from Mal's Darkblade. It starts with a random prophecy granted to the player by means of a block of text. The text then gives you innate clues to the location of the prophecy. For example, Tetto receives a vision that somewhere in the Southlands, the Warmbloods are getting close to uncovering an artifact of the Old Ones, and their recklessness will see it destroyed. A champion must infiltrate and recover it before it's too late. Something like that. This then tells the user it's located in the Southlands, in a settlement not controlled by undead or lizardmen, since it says Warmbloods. A hero has to perform an action against said settlement, since it's a champion. The reward is an item. That the prophecy will fail in 10 to 20 turns. Maybe there's something that says, if it's not recovered before too late, then it's on a timer, or if it says, you can just kind of go about this whenever. Something that kind of tells you roughly how long it'll take. From there, you can pay to narrow the prophecy down by essentially divining the Old One's motives, since the Southlands is huge. So maybe you pay like 1,000 gold to discover more about the reward, thus deciding if you want to even dedicate a hero towards the task. Oh, you find out it's purple. Okay, that's a little bit more worth my while. Then spend even more, like 2,500, with a 10-turn debuff on Tetto, resulting in him being exhausted, reducing his movement range, or maybe just a battlefield effect, whatever it is. And this would then tell you where the actual settlement is. These are just blanket numbers, of course, and there needs to be tweaking, but it'd be a means of a money sink towards a meaningful end, something the game needs in the mid to late portions that it also, play really well into Tetto's role as this grand Astromancer. In addition to the DLC mechanics, I'd love to see the geometric web retooled, perhaps adding in the path of the Old Ones that would use the geometric web to connect locations across the map, much like the newly reworked world routes added in for Wood Elves. The stronger their connection to the geometric web, the stronger the defenses of the settlements, with also the ability to traverse the path of the Old Ones. Nothing crazy, but something that makes the geometric web actually enjoyable rather than the rougher mechanic that it is now, kind of mediocre. So maybe something that as you increase that strength of that geometric web at a certain threshold, then you can traverse the path rather than you just being able to do it immediately. But there's a lot of really cool notions I have in mind for that geometric web. Moving into those starting locations, the starting locations for Tetto'eko can be easy if we just slap him in Tlaxtlan. That does place him right in between Luther Harkin to the east and Marcus Wolfheart to the west, and then Nakai and Gorok are at the south. So at least there's natural allies with the enemies. Expanding would be difficult, but another option could be the far northwest portion of the map. Even with Throt and Nyastra and Arahant added, that far northwest of Nagaroth is pretty devoid of legendary lords, and it'd be a fun location for the Lizardmen that's in an entirely different portion of the map. As for the Mortal Empires, I think that northwest portion makes the most sense, as Tlaxtlan is jammed up on this map. There are 7 legendary lords starting on the Lustria portion of Mortal Empires, with both Dreadfleet and Celestia Direfin a mere province or two away in northwest and northeasterly directions. Another option is on the other side of the mountain from the Last Defenders, in between both Krok-Gar and Tic-Tac-Toe. But I still think that the northwest of Nagaroth makes for the most fun and exciting place, while also very far away from the Lizardmen, creating a need for the geometric web to be retooled. Let's wrap our video up quickly, talking about the FLC options before concluding this massive speculation video here today. Alright, for our FLC, we have Beastlord Rakarth. Now, I don't think the faction would actually be called Karen Carr, but I mean, he does hail from Karen Carr, so I just went with it for the sake of naming mechanics. I couldn't think of a good enough name to really give him, but I did want to use the awesome faction symbol that Weapon Master 470 made for us. You can see that there on the right. It is gorgeous. Now, Beastlord Rakarth would be a character that would be dedicated, of course, to the beasts of the Dark Elves. The Bloodwrack Medusa, the Hydra, the Manticores, cold ones in their own right, sort of, right? All sorts of the disgusting monsters of the Dark Elves. And for mount options, we could see something like the Dark Steed, a Manticore, and then eventually the Black Dragon Brachus, the same one that he had in previous editions. Now, as far as his FLC mechanics, I think they have to be very bare bones, right? They have to be something that's either similar to something that already exists, or it's very minimal in its development. So I'm thinking something that combines both the Norskin and the Imric Dragon Hunt mechanics. Slap them together and do something that kind of has a special kind of unit that you get access to. Maybe a Chimera, his special Spell Thirster Hydra that was his lore specific Hydra, other things. Essentially, you defeat these targets, which result in recruitable Dark Elf versions. So it's not just simply Dark Elf units you'll be recruiting. Maybe you go on a hunt and you kill an Arachnarok Spider and you get an Arachnarok Spider that is adorned in Dark Elf fashion. I think since it's an FLC, it has to be units that are not behind a paywall. So as much as I would love to see a Dread Saurian decked out in Dark Elf like armor and everything like that with a whole bunch of like unnecessary spiky bits all over it, I think that because it's an FLC, there is some sort of limitation. I don't know, I'm making that speculation on that, but if there isn't, it'd be really cool to then see stuff like a Dread Saurian brought to the table, or the Rotting Leviathan. And maybe that's a little too much of a reach, but really try to create this notion almost of like a Pokemon master in a gotta catch 'em all type thing. And we have seen that added with some FLCs, that kind of gotta catch 'em all type mechanic, but I think it kind of fits the Beastlord Rakarth here, is that he's a character that has pretty much a version of everything in the Warhammer world in his repertoire, in his menagerie, as it were. So having that as a linchpin for his FLC mechanic, I think makes the most sense. Well, at that, it brings our video to a close, and this was a lot bigger than I thought it would be. We covered a lot of content here across the Lizardmen, across the Beastmen, across the FLC. So go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are about some of these propositions, the speculation. Do you think it's going to be Dark Elves as the full dedicated DLC faction? I mean, if you think about it, every Game 2 race has got 6 Legendary Lords. The only one who doesn't is the Dark Elves. They've got 5. So if this proposition or this speculation goes through, the Lizardmen will have 7 and everyone else will have 6, because the FLC would be Rakarth, so that would be 6 for the Dark Elves. But there are still plenty of options here, right? We didn't talk about the High Elves and how they're missing the Lothern, Skycutter, and Sea Helms. So there are plenty of options here on the table. I just wanted to present some of my speculations for what I at least feel makes maybe the most sense. And trust me, my mind was dead set on it being Warriors of Chaos and Beastmen. I really wanted to see Valkia the Bloody. She's one of my favorite characters from the Warriors of Chaos, but I just think that the more I look at it, the more it makes sense that we would see Warriors of Chaos and Norska getting updated in Game 3 alongside the presence of the Chaos Gods with a hopeful Chaos Demons and so on and so forth. You could even argue that the Beastmen fall into that category because of the corn-flavored gore units and all the other units from the Beastmen roster that can have marks of Chaos Gods. So maybe it's not even going to be the Beastmen. Maybe it'll be 2 Game 2 races to conclude the Game 2 before Game 3 starts. There are so many options on the tables here, guys. So like I said before, go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what you feel makes the most sense, or maybe you want to propose some different mechanics, whatever it is. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. I hope you had a safe holidays, a good new year, and you're ready for 2021. But as always, have a good one and take care.